throughout North Mississippi. Not so much in South Mississippi, where they prefer galleries all the way across both elevations or across the first, but in North Mississippi you find that. A very simple, straightforward, very Greek looking, but very American at the same time. The Greeks did use some square columns and pilasters, not to the extent that we did, but square pilasters, square columns are fairly easy to make out of wood. They can be easily repaired and replaced. So it was an obvious thing to do, and it gives that heavy monumentality that you always think about with Greek temples. Okay, here's the storefront we started talking about earlier. You can see right there that it is cast iron, of course. Notice the wonderful paneling effect you get here with the cast iron. Very Italianate, very 1870s and even 80s. If you go into houses that you know were built in the 1870s, you'll find this sort of paneling effect on the doors and door and window reveals, and wherever they did paneling, you'll find this. So this is a very interesting example in cast iron for commercial purposes of what was popular even in domestic architecture. Notice the cast iron threshold was there. There was a door there, of course. I don't remember what it was like. But you see the large amounts of plate glass, which might almost be too much. Looks like it needs a transom, but they kept the idea going. If you've ever gone down a street and you open shop window, all of a sudden they're bricked up, it gets your attention. You know something's wrong. So that's what we talk about, continuing the streetscape. And I think we can see very similar cast iron down the way with a little plaque. So this is probably made by the company that made those. It just has a very similar appearance to it. But this is very simple. Notice at the very top, where that blank area is right above the cap of the pilaster, there's nothing there. We're going to see other examples very similar to this where there's a little cast iron rosette, a little flat flower in those places. So we'll see that as we go. Another thing we deal with a lot in historic buildings are awnings. Not just balconies, but awnings. You know, awnings had a very practical use. You've got a lot of glass, you've got a lot of exposure. You need to have a way to control that. But you don't always want 100-degree sun beating through the glass and melting everything inside. But you do want the ability to control it. So the original awnings were canvas that could be brought down and then pulled back up again, like you would think about blinds in a house. That was a very similar effect. Then as we got later on in technology, metal awnings began to be used. You see a lot of wooden awnings, so you see a variety of them. But again, this has been here for a long time, and when they go to replace this, if they replace it with something else, it needs to be based on historic evidence and photographs of what this building did look like. But again, you can see the same idea that we saw beginning in the late 19th century, continuing through the 20th century with large open glass. This is, of course, bigger than technology could have provided in the 1870s and 80s, but by the 1950s and 60s, no problem. The bulkhead is a very small piece of metal, a simple entrance, no operable transoms in this, but you have all of this glass. So it's the ultimate idea of what they were moving towards in the late 19th century. To get all of your goods on display, you can see through to the store, see what's going on, and people are a lot more likely to go in a building if there are people in there they can see it. So we see how all of that comes into play in our historic building. I'll walk on down a little more. You can look back to the Thompson House. You can really appreciate again from this angle too the way the pilasters go and give the effect of the columns around the building. And the nice little porch on the second floor with the shed roof with the nice little Victorian fretwork is also a very nice effect. And that's the historic photograph shows that being done back in the late 19th century.
Hello.
Now, this is a very interesting storefront, kind of an interesting preservation question if you think about it. Look at the end of pilaster strips, very elaborate cast iron detailing all of there at the top and the bottom. You have completely round with octagonal bases here on a cast iron threshold. So all of this is, 1890s or so. But we see the storefront itself is probably an alteration about 1940. So again, we're getting 60 years ago, and in historic preservation, we consider 50 years to be about the time you start looking at the historic significance of a building. So we have an alteration that occurred probably about 50 years ago. Does the same thing we talked about with all the glass. So if the commission were ever, or a commission were ever to be faced with a situation like this, they would have to seriously consider Do you lose historic 50-year-old for brand new replicated work, or do you keep the original 50? One of those interesting questions. I would love to see what's above here. I bet you, as we'll go and see in a few minutes, there's some very nice cast iron capitals, probably as part of this original up hidden behind all of that work. I was in the commercial building in Canton that had a very similar thing done to it in the 1960s. You could climb across the top of the storefront and see the original capitals just preserved with inside. It was really great. Now, a lot of these buildings, as we know, are two-story, and very often, this was not originally here like this, I'm sure, I know, but very often there is a secondary stair coming straight off the sidewalk to go to the second floor to give access to doctor's offices or lawyer's offices. Some cases even housing originally. I think in most cases, if it was the house, the residence of the business owner, you would have had access from the inside from another stairway and not straight off the sidewalk in a lot of cases. But you know, there's always different ways of doing things. But very often you will find the access straight off the sidewalk to the second floor. Now this is the other storefront, and I want to point out this. You can see, right, it's so nice when people leave those. We love little clues. Livermore Foundry and Machine Company, Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, that one says Chickasaw.
Chickasaw, thank you. I knew there was one. There's a better one down here, I think. That's a Chickasaw. So again, you saw their round columns earlier. Livermore Foundry. This is a very similar effect to the one on the corner, but this has the rosettes. And keep this in mind because when we go to Nelson's in a few minutes, same cast iron storefront. This has the cast iron threshold, big, wonderful, intact storefront, nice double leaf doors. It's a beautifully intact storefront. We're very fortunate it's here. And the stair that was added later at some point when they subdivided this, they did pretty well. But they needed obviously access to the second floor from the street, so they put that in. And again, another plaque on this end, on this pilaster. And then there's some, they were very proud. This one's marked all over the place. Unfortunately, they're not all marked like that. Now, sometimes you get in a situation where you have a building that's been there for 100+ years, but the storefront has been completely changed, and there's no physical evidence, there's no archival evidence of what was ever there historically. So very often, what's decided upon is a totally new storefront. You're not replicating anything that you're not sure was there. You're giving the same effect, you're respecting the streetscape, but it's a totally new design. And that's certainly something that does have appropriateness in the historic preservation circle. But if you know what it looked like, it's always good to try and keep that. And we'll keep going down this way. It's another example of those engaged columns. Very simple, more of the freestanding octagonal columns with a little bit of a fretwork behind, the cast iron threshold, a brand new building. So we're kind of going around. We'll see in a minute how you can really appreciate the window hoods on this building on the second floor when we get across the street. You can't see them with this elaborate porch around here, but I want to point them out when we get over there. And also the fact that apparently this was the first building built back after the war. Somewhere within this building are the remains of that building. So it's just interesting to point out. I want us to walk down this street and make a quick little loop, and I want to point out some things that happened that shouldn't have, and really I have to place the blame for it on our department. The Department of Archives and History is the State Historic Preservation Office for the state of Mississippi. It's our responsibility to administer the federal preservation laws for the country, for the state and the state of Mississippi. As such, anytime there's any federal funding or federal licensing that goes on, we, by federal law, are required to review it, make sure that there's no adverse effect on the historic property or district before it happens. That includes FDIC insurance, which includes banks. So we are supposed to be aware of when branch banks are built or banks are remodeled and changed, that there's no negative impact if we can avoid it. The Renaissance Bank, and this actually came to our office, came through our office. Our staff looked at it, didn't realize it was in the National Register District, and said, okay, fine. Well, it is.